Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our 9th webinar in this series, Raising the Roof, the Art of the Transformational Gifts. So a little background for you guys. For those who don't know, the House of Development is a concept developed by Cogio to illustrate the building blocks of a successful organization and explain why development is so crucial to fundraising, recruiting, and achieving your organization's goals. I'll start off the webinar with a little housekeeping. My name is Whit Godden, and I am the Director of Strategic Marketing over at TAP Network. TAP Network is a marketing technology agency that strives to support nonprofits through accessible and innovative marketing technology solutions and strategies. I'll be moderating the webinar along with introducing our main speaker today and providing some insights on how to use technology to deal with moves management and drive nonprofits' mission awareness and increase membership engagement. For those of you, we will be taking questions at the end. So desktop viewers can submit through the chat option on the GoToWebinar interface. And those who have dialed in are not able to submit questions, but are more than welcome to contact us afterwards. And now our main speaker, Rob Kusel, Managing Director of Cogio. Cogio provides organizational advice and development services to nonprofits to optimize their efficiency and long-term sustainability. He's worked with organizations such as Essex and Drake Fundraising Council, Blue Oak School, Stanford University, and his own alma mater, Williams College. And now I'll hand it off to Rob.
Thanks, Whit. So if we go to let's go right to slide number 3. You'll see here that we're down to the 9th presentation, and we're going to focus on transformational gifts. We're going to be very subjective. We're going to examine case studies, 2 historic case studies, and then several other subjective where a Cogio consultant was involved. So if we go to the next slide, you can see now that this is putting the roof on the house, right? It's really a transformational gift that will ensure sustainability in either one programmatic area or overall for the agency, depending on the restriction of the transformational gift if there was one. This could also pertain to buildings as well as overall endowment reserve funds. We'll talk about the correlation between a mature legacy society and the increased potentials for a transformational gift toward the end of my part of the presentation. So it's, again, very high up in the house, because remember, it goes from the bottom up, right, beginning with PR. And the next slide really demonstrates, actually it'll be the following slide. This slide really, just to give you goals and context for today, slide 5. What's the definition of a transformational gift? We'll talk about that. Understanding donor relationships and how the entire House of Development, complemented by sustained moves management, really correlates to the potential for a transformational gift or several. Readiness, understanding better awareness of how to analyze and evaluate your organization's ability to actually attract such a transaction. And then data. Whit will focus toward the end of the presentation on moves management and how clean and organized data systems are critical to promoting the likelihood of a transformational gift transaction. The next slide is a good visual. The house does a good job from a structural standpoint, but this slide actually gives you the path toward the green flag, which is that potentially transformational gift. These are the most common, right? Where there's multi-generational activity within the agency, beginning at the onset with PR, social media, website as a startup, and then over the generations, really refining events, their annual and membership giving and/or membership giving, their work with foundations and corporations, making sure that they've got a comprehensive plan giving and bequest program, a strong major gifts program, and perhaps, particularly if they have a building, a capital campaign or two. All of these ingredients, all of these tactics are generally critical toward having the type of agency that can attract that kind of gift. It's really the road, in other words, to that. Great visual for the board. The next slide is our first well-known case study. Now, Joan Kroc was Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's Corporation, the hamburger joint. She was his third wife. And in her 2003 will, expressed an interest in giving away a big chunk of her fortune. And in aggregate, it was 1.96 billion. 1.6 billion of which went to the Salvation Army, which really transformed that agency and its ability to do a lot more work in a meaningful way, as well as modernize its infrastructure, namely its trucks, which we see parading around the country. NPR, National Public Radio, received 225 million, which they invested in an endowment. And then smaller, although huge, gifts to the University of San Diego's, where she founded the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, and that did the same thing at the University of Notre Dame. 20 million for the hospice and palliative care, and then another 10 for the zoo, and then 5 for the local KPBS. This was not random. The Salvation Army did a lot of work cultivating her over the years. The only one that was random was NPR. They had no idea. There was no major gift officer working with her. It was a decision that she made because of her love for KPBS. And so that was really the only surprise. The others were very much cultivated and negotiated over time. The next slide is another very interesting situation. And the case study here is Danielle and Chuck Feeney. Chuck Feeney is Irish and was the founder, or of Irish roots. I'm not sure if he was born in Ireland, and the founder of Duty Free Shoppers in the 1960s. And when you go to the airport, you might see these duty free shop for people who are going across the ocean, and you have to have a passport, etc., to acquire stuff. So it was a genius move, and he really amassed quite a fortune. But the story, essentially a multi-billionaire couple who created what is known as Atlantic Philanthropies. The decision was made literally on November, right before Thanksgiving in 1984, where Danielle, Chuck, and his lawyer flew to the Bahamas, and the location was chosen to avoid huge legal penalties for what they did at that day, which was transfer everything into Atlantic Philanthropies. He divested himself of all that he owned, cash, businesses, shares, and placed them into this foundation known today as Atlantic Philanthropies. Now, this was done in a real secret environment. Forbes didn't even know this was going on. And he used the foundation, the Atlantic Philanthropies, to actually transact properties globally. So he kept up the appearance of being a billionaire, all the while having done this in the Bahamas with his wife. So now we have $8 billion in assets. As I mentioned, he continued to buy properties. But essentially what happened was this: he transformed the Irish university system, as well as most of the technological advances in that country. So you see the correlation between Ireland booming in the late 80s and what Danielle and Chuck did. The biggest decision came in 2003, where as a couple, they decided to give it all away in his lifetime. And the final initiative came in 2016, 4 years ago, where they created, with the last 600 million, Atlantic Fellows, the Global Atlantic Fellows. And they leveraged existing infrastructure, namely I think it was Trinity University in Ireland and the British Health Institute, the Global Brain Health Institute, as well as the University of California, San Francisco for equity in brain health. So their big focus toward the end was brain. And so he still lives. He's 88, single, living in a rented apartment, I should say widowed, living in a rented apartment in San Francisco. And his quote, it was an article that was written in 2018, when asked why he did this, he said it was the right thing to do. So true altruist in this sense. So these, again, were two very well-known, sort of massive deals. In other words, one was a will, the other was giving in his lifetime or in their lifetime, but both incredibly dramatically impactful in a number of key areas globally. Now, to be sure, these are big numbers, right? But remember that it's really important when you think of your own agency to think about its annual budget and what that would mean in terms of a transformational gift. And there is no equation, there's no set formula, but certainly if the gift has a massive impact in terms of alleviating stress and really creating a sense of permanence and sustainability, then you can consider it a transformational gift. Now, the following several case studies, the numbers are a little bit more digestible, but you'll see the impact was equally formidable. And these we were involved with one way or another. This one I was on the board of directors. This was New Tech Foundation. It was founded as New Tech Foundation at the turn of the century in Napa, California. It's now known as the New Tech Network of Schools, and you'll see why over the next 5 minutes. It started as a single unit high school in Napa that essentially was created as a project-based learning environment. So the flagship, again, was in Napa, California. I think 2001 was the first year of operation, but don't quote me. Right around there. So as a board, we knew that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation then, not anymore, but then they were showing a big interest in the United States in high schools and transforming high schools, leveraging project-based learning methodology. So Bill Gates himself is a big fan of group environment learning, as well as group project execution. If you look at the way Microsoft has been built, that's how they operate. So because of the synergies around project-based learning and transforming high schools, we thought we were a pretty good fit. So we put in an initial request for $250,000, which was a lot of money then because it wasn't a big high school. And the Gates Foundation came back, to our surprise, with a demand that New Tech Foundation replicate. They loved the model, so they suggested that we consider replicating the model and they specified particularly they wanted struggling inner city high schools. So not create new high schools, but rather transform existing high schools that were low performing in inner cities around the country. Now, the board of directors for the local Napa school was not set up for this kind of activity. So three of us thought long and hard of whether we should consider their initial seed funding of $5 million to accomplish this. And we identified 2 or 3 individuals around the Bay Area whom we felt would be strategically helpful in the process, and we onboarded them. Bob Perlman was a key player. And if you Google this project, you'll see he played a huge role. And we recruited Bob to the board of directors to really reflect having to execute on these new strategic imperatives. Because if we were going to take $5 million, we had better be able to do what they requested. So the net is it worked. We created massive back-end systems to ensure that curriculum and anything pedagogically related was engaged and accessible through cloud technologies. So this was before cloud even existed. We created a custom cloud. And then we had these fairly intensive summer training seminars and sessions, initially in Napa, but now because they've grown so much, they've actually moved it to the Los Angeles Marriott Convention Center every summer. And today it's now New Tech Network. It's still headquartered on Main Street in Napa, and I think Bob is still involved. But it's grown so much in 20 years that now it works in 200 districts around the USA. It's also in Australia and China and other countries globally. 120 high schools. They migrated the program to the middle schools and elementary schools as well, which makes sense. 5,000 teachers under payroll and 85,000 students impacted annually. So in 20 years, so you understand the transformative nature of the $5 million investment, which was fantastic by the Gates Foundation initially. It went from being a high school of 250 to now serving over 85,000 students globally. It's an interesting case. The next case study, completely different mission. And we, by design, picked California-based 501c3s. This is the Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired in San Francisco. They essentially develop cutting-edge technologies to assist individuals navigate communities and public spaces. So to give you an example, what Uber and Lyft came on the scene really transformed these individuals' lives in terms of ability to get from A to B in a really safe environment for the most part. So when you think of these technologies, think of an iPhone and having an app that would give a visually impaired or blind individual routing access and directions around airports, around subway systems, large universities. So think of a guiding, tracking app. So they plug it into their ear, and then they're guided around various infrastructures. And this is what the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco is doing. They are the leader globally among all the lighthouses in building out these technologies, which makes sense given where they're located right next to the epicenter for technology in the Silicon Valley and San Francisco Bay Area. So this is a really interesting case. Ironically, we were about to launch a capital campaign with them, and I'll talk about that in a second, when all of this occurred in 2015, so 5 years ago. It's fairly recent. So they got word that a Seattle-based reclusive multimillionaire identified the Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired as leading the way in developing adaptive technologies for global use. So this is a guy who spent a lot of time recluse, just scouring the internet for information. So this is a man whose name was Donald Sirkin, lifelong visual impaired to quasi-blindness. Total denial through his lifetime, right to his death. It led him to an eccentric behaviors and total reclusiveness as he aged. However, because he was also a genius, he developed a successful insurance business industry from the ground up and was incredibly generous to all of his employees. There are stories about him when deals were made that he would give $1,000 to every employee. Just an amazing guy, but very eccentric. Sometime before his death, he instructed his attorneys to name San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired as the primary beneficiary of his entire estate, except for $250,000 each to his two children. And in 2015, he died of heart failure at his home. His body was undiscovered for a week because, again, he was a recluse. Now, Jennifer Sachs, who's the director of development at Lighthouse for the Blind, described to me her and the executive director's visit to the home after the death. And the home was huge, and he had moved to a small room by the kitchen and was living his entire life there alone. And that's where he was finally discovered. And the net is the Lighthouse has been beneficiary of a bequest of over $125 million, which is 15 times the Lighthouse's annual budget of approximately $8 million. But the great news is this: it's accelerated Brian, who's the executive director, their ability to do these technologies around the world. So this will have a massive impact for all visually impaired, beginning in this country and then moving out. So again, massively impactful. But think of the characteristics of this individual. He had no association. He had never given a dime and selected them only because he felt they were best of breed for a lifelong disease, which he denied, but felt he could actually improve other people's lives, much like when he was handing out $1,000 while he was alive as a CEO. So there's an interesting correlation there. And the lesson of that story is, whatever your mission is, do it the best possible, so that one day you may actually be beneficiary of somebody who has these kinds of qualities. Okay, with the next slide, again, this was recent. This is a sports organization, again, based out of San Francisco. And it's a San Francisco Elite Academy. It's an elite soccer club with junior, youth, and senior teams. Now, when we say junior, we're talking, very young. Youth is up to 15, and senior is 15 through high school. Now, this is a remarkable story because San Francisco has a reputation for being wealthy, but there is a subsection of San Francisco which is not at all wealthy. And there's a lot of talent in soccer, several subsections, districts. But this club, from the inception in 2014, committed to socioeconomic access, regardless of a family's ability to pay, and offered generous need-based financial aid packages, again, from its inception in 2014, which is to say, if at tryouts, a kid, an individual, showed the capacity to compete at the highest level, because they do play in the National Premier Leagues, then that individual will be funded. Now, those of you who have kids playing sports, you know that it's not just paying dues. In this case, there's travel involved. There's a lot of equipment to be bought and to be refreshed. And in this case, they included all of those costs as part of the inclusionary process, which is remarkable, given the onslaught of the pay-to-play model that we all experience as families today. So what were the elements of attaining, in this case, a $500,000 contribution over 5 years by a foundation donor-advised fund? We developed a case statement, which is on the Cogeo website. You can get a link to that or just click on it later on when you come back to this. We did a total analysis of their membership in terms of the wealth potential, because we've got the capacities to do that internally. Then we deployed a series of cultivation events, and we did this on a high frequency. It seems to work in that city. It's a very compact city, and it's easy to get around. And then we established a culture of development, fundraising from the onset. Didn't wait a year or two. We just said we're going to create that, much like an independent school does. And then we did really strong messaging. If you look at their case statement, you'll see really strong messaging around commitment to socioeconomic inclusion and these generous financial aid packages. So literally a dozen cultivation events. At one such event, unknown to us, a parent member attended the meeting and heard the message. And it turned out her husband had been in technology, and they created a family foundation, which, by the way, there's been a lot of creation on donor-advised funds in the last decade or so, which is going to be the next trendy thing. But in this case, it's a pure foundation. And ironically, the foundation, ironically meaning positively, the foundation, their mission is just that. It's socioeconomic inclusion. So the message was loud and clear. She had a kid. Her daughter played in the club and really, really enjoyed and felt that the club was true to its mission. And so we helped them negotiate a 5-year pledge in late 2017, which resulted in, we asked for, I think, $650. It resulted in a $500,000 contribution over 5 years, beginning in 2018, right through 2022. And by the way, so what we're doing, and the next webinar is going to be on stewardship practices. In this case, we implemented a comprehensive stewardship practices with quarterly reports on impact of what $25,000 is doing per quarter, given that they're receiving $100,000. So it comes in early January. In March, they get a report. In June, they get a report. Right. In September, they get a report. And then again in January, they'll get a thank you letter for whatever, for the next payment. That then, we're hoping, will lead to another investment in 2022, which may even be higher. Now, why was this a transformational gift to this academy? Because the academy, its fundraising budget was not big at all, right? And its budget overall wasn't big. Its membership dues, right? And so 100,000 per year over 5 years, which they could count on, is truly transformative because they can take the 100,000 they were due to spend and leverage it elsewhere, namely getting the best possible coaches, which is what they did. And now they're considered literally one of the top clubs in the country because of this. So again, money does make a difference. This is an interesting case. So with the next slide, these are exceptions. And we see this quite often. We picked 4 because we were involved again, so we know. But generally, a transformational gift comes with decades of cultivation. And I'll talk about the traits of for a smaller agency of what that transformational donor would look like. But there are transformational gifts that occur up front, at the onset of an agency. And who are these? Well, generally, they're high net worth individuals who want something done, who feel that something is missing in the community, therefore they need to act, or businesses, or a series of businesses, or government in some cases as well. We do see public-private partnerships. What sectors? Most seen in independent schools and the arts, although we're beginning to see public-private partnerships in community centers and things like that. And we did 4 examples. The first is Bay School. This was an interesting one because it was a bunch of multimillionaires who rallied around a really credible head of school, a guy named Malcolm Manson, who had been former head of school at Marin Country Day in the Cathedral School for Boys in San Francisco. And in 1992, they urged him to conceive the idea of a new high school. They incorporated in 96 as the Bay School, and then they opened in 2004 in the Presidio. And it's a really, really nice campus. Blue Oak School, that again was the result of a multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, couple who moved into Napa. He had been chairman of AOL, and it was his second marriage, her first, and so they had young kids. And so they looked at the schools and didn't like any of the schools in Napa, so they decided to found the first now accredited independent school in the Napa Valley, the Blue Oak School. And so they invested millions in refurbishing a downtown property and bringing it up to speed, getting ahead of school, getting staff, and so it was a huge investment, and also allocated a lot of financial aid from the get-go to ensure diversity. We see this not often, but it occurs in communities where charter schools or independent schools are put up. Lucky Penny, there had been very little theater production in the Napa Valley. And there was a young woman whose parents were wealthy vineyard owners, who was a really good actress. And with her partner, Barry Martin, she invested and they put up this production company. And now up until this latest crisis, it's been sustaining itself very nicely. They just moved into a new center. But again, it took the vision of an individual and a family fortune to do this. Hotchkiss School is really interesting because that was one of the first out of the gate at the turn of the century. So there's a picture of a gun to your right. That's the Hotchkiss Fet gun. And Mariah Hotchkiss, she was the founder and owner of this company. And with her fortune, because she was really good friends with the president of Yale, who wanted a preparatory school for men, because they weren't co-ed back then in the 1890s. She put up the Hotchkiss School in Connecticut, which now comprises over 280 acres. Initially, she donated 64 acres and put up the main building. But the legacy is massive. It's one of the top schools in the world, and just a brilliant campus. And to date, oh, by the way, the other thing you should know about Mariah Hotchkiss, tuition when they opened was $600 a year, but not all of the 52 boys could afford that. So they had a generous financial aid program right out of the gate. Today, Hotchkiss gives 35% of their students financial aid, 8.7 million a year, which is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. The next slide, before Whit takes over on data, I'm going to give you some conclusions, some takeaways, because this is what you need to think about. Unless it's catalyzed by upfront investors, an organizational transformational gift is the result of generationally implementing all elements of the House of Development, so that road we took earlier, all the while promoting best business practices and excellence in the pursuit of your mission. Why did the Lighthouse get that transfer? Because they had the best product on the market. Here's what we also know. Planned giving, and particularly bequests, right, will give you the opportunity to actually get that transformational gift, because some bequests can be dramatically large. Now, what are the traits, what are the characteristics of a typical bequest donor? Long-time donor, generational generally, somebody who gives not generally large amounts every year, attractive donor potentially in that category would be somebody who gives, an individual who gives, unmarried individual who gives consistently with no children, therefore needs beneficiaries. Right? And again, I'm being a little crass here, but that's how you need to think. Right? It's certainly how we thought at Stanford as we approached people for bequests. Again, consistent givers, therefore they will have affinity, and no set hairs. Now, the role of bequests. If you look at the Ivy League schools, if you look at Stanford, if you look at MIT, Caltech, et cetera, and these are the big boys, right? They're the big players on the marketplace in the industry. They each have massive endowments, and I mean multi-billion in some cases, yet they're continuously the beneficiary of large bequests, many of which are still transformative. Right? Harvard will get a $100 million bequest. They'll continue raising like crazy. Right? And so why? Because people feel like it's a really good investment, right? Even though they already are so wealthy. And that's the way you need to think about that. So when people say, well, should we have a large reserve? Won't we get punished? Won't donors think we? Quite the contrary. You should have a large reserve. You should have a full endowment. There's no doubt that people will see you as a much more positive investment. And that is a really important takeaway for everybody today. And the bottom line is this. When an organization commits to and achieves a mature bequest legacy society, and it's going to take 20 years, 30 years, then the likelihood of being the beneficiary of such a transformative bequest will definitely increase over time. Particularly, and I'll close with this statement before you take over, particularly with what we now know is going to be a generational wealth pass-through as the baby boomer generation passes up, moves on. They're going to pass on some of that wealth, a lot of that wealth, through to donor-advised funds, which will benefit the 501c3 industry, or directly to the 501c3 that they themselves support. So my final point if you're not in the game of bequests, of marketing bequests, you need to be immediately, because you'll miss out. Because unbeknownst to you, and I mentioned this in the planned giving webinar, unbeknownst to you in a back room, somebody's advisor is asking them, okay, well, you do want to give some of your fortune away to the 501c3. Who are your charities of choice? And unbeknownst to you, they may be, mentioning you. So that's the key takeaway. All right, Whit, you take it away from here.
Thanks, Rob. Awesome. Those case studies were super informative and pretty incredible stories. And just wanted to start off the conversation from the digital and the moves management side. Like if these case studies seemed a little staggering, and I know Rob touched on this as well, but it's somewhat hard to relate to as a small or medium nonprofit. I want to sort of be the optimist in the conversation and say, don't feel like you can't put yourself in the position to be the next recipient of that $120 million bequest. Because if you take a look, where are we now? We're in a digital era. We're more connected than we've ever been. And as time moves on and technology evolves, we'll be relying more and more on these forms of communication as it integrates itself into almost everything we do. And I wanted to share a metric here from an M&R benchmark report that showed a 50% increase in mobile fundraising transactions in 2019. So I think that's just an overall indication of the behavioral transition in the world of donorship and the general sense of giving. So these digital connections are going to become much more important and vital to securing the roadmap for building these transformational gift opportunities. So I'm going to be discussing and addressing these three sort of scenarios that Rob outlined in his case studies, and identify some best tactics and tools to help you guys attract and or identify opportunities, as well as best ways to leverage them for momentum in your nonprofit's fundraising strategy. So briefly, to kind of recap those three main types of scenarios, first, we've got that multi-generation involvement that Rob so eloquently discussed on that conclusion slide. We also have the every now and then the front-end investor, as well as, in the Lighthouse example, the unsuspecting or the unknown donor. So let's take a look a little bit at the multi-generation investor. And this is, that years and years of work. But we have tools in our tool belt for tracking and monitoring the current membership base. And that's going to be vital and key to making sure that you're always on the lookout for that diamond in the rough. So as you move through your communication strategy, you do want to make sure that you're speaking to each and every person as if they could be that next large endowment prospect. However, we do have these tools that can help us identify who in that current membership or audience base may be a more viable candidate and ensure that we're monitoring that engagement in your database. You can leverage that information to make more specific communication strategies. So I like this diagram because it sort of outlines how you can take raw data points or raw data buckets in your communication channels and use that to make super informed decisions. So let's start with the affinity sort of circle here. So chances are this is someone who's been making either large or medium gifts, depending on how heavily they are involved in your nonprofit. So you want to take a look and see, like, how involved are they in your campaigns and events? Are you tracking their behavior in your CRM tool? On top of donations, have they made any non-monetary gifts? Have they volunteered before? And have they attended any of your events? So you want to start to identify that level of affinity. Second, you want to start to monitor and identify their affluence. So in addition to the information provided by your CRM, many nonprofits purchase wealth screening software that are able to assess their donors' giving capacity. And there was a case study that Rob reviewed where they did actually go through and they assessed their membership's wealth. I believe that was the Elite Academy. However, if you don't have the ability or the financial capacity to do that, you can always look to the demographic indicators, as Rob mentioned in the conclusion, sort of their age, their marital status, their occupation, whether or not they have children, and that can also help you identify the affluence possibility of a potential donor. And lastly, pretty obvious but worth noting is, do you have access to this individual? Is there a personal connection that you have with this particular person, whether or not it's through the board, through your staff, maybe through the steering committee, or perhaps even members of your network. So making sure and identifying that you have access to these people, that's sort of the synergistic three Venn diagram that's going to really help drive the opportunity to identify these multi-generation investors with a much more strategic approach and using those tools to your benefit. So let's talk about the front-end investors. So these are people obviously who have created a strong foundation by investing in a nonprofit upfront. They're sort of the angel. And now, as the nonprofit's leadership, as you guys all are, it's your responsibility to leverage this opportunity and keep it growing, right? Utilize that front end investor endowment sort of as an opportunity to keep momentum forward. So it's important that you strategically communicate how and where these funds are being used as to not hurt individual or multi-generation opportunities, right? So some key strategies is to minimize the identity of these investors in the communications, and rather highlight you guys, the leadership that are involved, perhaps the board of directors, and really drive home the mission and purpose in your communication strategy. And I think another really great way to sort of pay homage to these front-end investors and drive the success and sort of get that jump start is and maintain that momentum is to identify and build the community. Get creative with social media. Again, we're more connected than ever. There's always an opportunity and a way to get your membership to talk to one another and engage with one another and help spread the mission and the purpose of your nonprofit. And it may even come down to building custom apps where you can be more engaged one-on-one with your membership or your audience. But these are going to help build the community and drive the success of these initial front-end transformational gifts. And then lastly, the unknown donor, right? This is the lighthouse example that Rob put together for us to show us. You know, this person didn't actually know who and what the organization didn't know this individual at all. There was no relationship. He happened to just find this nonprofit through his website perusing. So what can you do? You can make sure that your digital footprint is ready for the pitch, right? So are you representing your organization as someone who would be able to take that large investment and really make a difference? So how can you do that? You want to optimize your digital footprint as much as you can. So on your website, are you highlighting your leadership? Are you showcasing your vital partnerships? As far as your actual technical strategy and content strategy, are you presenting yourselves as thought leaders through the content you're putting out? Are you building that content to drive your SEO optimization? If you don't have a good SEO and you've got this multi-millionaire sitting at his computer Google searching, blindness nonprofits, and your SEO is not very good, you're not going to come up and rank high in that search field, and he may never have known that you exist. And then lastly, do you have that connected community? Do you have a strong social presence, either digitally or in person? Are you active within your organization sector? So that's sort of the end of the content. I think those three examples of potential donorship opportunities and looking at the tools and strategies from a communications and digital perspective is really vital and really helpful to take a look at. So with that, I want to just wrap things up, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So first of all, thank you, Rob, so much for the informative presentation. And we do have some questions to ask of you if you have a couple moments. So the first question we have is, we are a small nonprofit. Is there anything we can do proactively to attract such a donor that may provide a transformational gift?
Yeah, no, that's a great. Oh, one more thought before I answer that question. This is actually this is pretty funny. So when the Lighthouse was notified of that bequest, we had just launched a $5 million relocation campaign. So they were going to move from one building to their new headquarters. And the board, rightfully so, asked us, Kojia, should we even do the campaign? And I'm going to give you a second to think through the answer, what our answer would have been and was. And our answer was, of course you do the campaign. This is an opportunity to engage other foundations. You've got more credibility. You can make new relationships, get incremental funds. And the analogy we used was this. And there's several analogies going back to those major universities, the Ivies. When Stanford receives, say, a $50 million bequest, do they stop? No, they accelerate activity. So the board did the right thing. They ran the campaign, which was successful. They created good, strong relationships, and they're thriving even more. So I just wanted to add that. Now, to answer your question, unfortunately, you can't really be proactive. You can only be proactive in as far as what Whit was describing: optimal search engine, making sure that you're doing the best you can to meet your mission and be as impactful as possible in the community, making sure that you're doing all the right things in terms of communication and relationship management, making sure that the stewardship procedures are really, really strong, that they're better than your, and what is your competition? Well, your competition are the other 501c3s to which that potential entity is giving currently. So the more stewardship activity, personalized, meaningful stewardship activity, quarterly touches, that will actually drive the opportunity for success up. And so I guess my answer would boil down to really, with one more thought, really strong stewardship, individualized, donor-centric stewardship practices. So that's all I want to add.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. All right, so you have another one. So this question is about legacy societies. So they said we don't have a legacy society at this point. So what steps should this organization take moving forward if they don't have a legacy society?
Right. We see several paths. It takes some resources. The key is setting up the infrastructure and making sure that you're communicating to the right aged people, given that this generational pass-through is about to occur. Well, actually, it started. And so there are really several ways to think about it. You can mimic what a similar agency is doing, leveraging your current infrastructure, so dedicating resources 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week, working with a firm like Cogeo, which does this kind of activity, which helps organizations set up. Whenever we sign a client, if they don't have a legacy society, in month 4 or 5, that's one of the activities we initiate. So we mandate that, and they're not going to argue against it. And then the other way is to find a volunteer, somebody who specializes in wills or trusts, who gets it and who has affinity toward your organization and who would want to take this on. Now, the only risk there is that these people tend to be very busy and are getting busier because of this pass-through, and so they may not have the time or the bandwidth. They may say they do, but they may not be able to. But if you trust that person, if you trust her and her ability to actually execute with some guidance or not, then that's also a plausible solution. So again, I'll reiterate: 1, do it yourself by mimicking. 2, get help. And 3, find a volunteer who has, she'll have the expertise to help implement. But the key, as I mentioned, Whit, is the execution of the implementation. So the work really happens up front. Thereafter, it's really just consistent marketing and storytelling and third-party validation. That's all I want to add, Whit.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's wonderful. So the next question is regarding stewardship strategy. So is the stewardship strategy for major gifts different than transformational gifts?
It better not be. No, that's a joke. No, it should be the same, right? Because if in fact you're using best business practices, that means that you're actually implementing them across the board. Therefore, everybody is affected. I'll give you an example. A really good example. Let's say you run a special event that's gala oriented. Therefore, you're requiring lots. You're getting whatever you're going to sell at your gala, whether it's wine or trips or whatever. And so 2 to 3 months before the gala, somebody, it could be volunteers, it could be staff, will be soliciting the lots, right? And so you might get notification that a winery or a business is willing to donate X services. So this would be an example of exceptional stewardship and differential stewardship. If you as an agency received a special lot from the business, the stewardship implication would be for somebody to immediately contact that business and thank them on the spot for doing this. Why? Because no other 501c3 that I know of would go through that trouble. They don't have the bandwidth. But if you can do that simple differentiator, that donor-centric touch, it will make a huge difference in terms of your ability to procure something similar the following year. And for this, for larger transactions, it goes back to taking the lump transaction. So if it's $1,000 transaction, which is a major gift, right, and stewarding that gift every quarter and explaining to the donor entity what $250 was able to do, if in fact it was a $1,000 gift. And so we, of course, implement this with all of our clients. It works. It's a huge differentiator, and it allows them to have that much more success with major donors. And I certainly know that it will help with transformational donors potentially, because it's a differentiator. So that's the answer.
Great, thank you. Awesome. And then we have one more, which is what are the common traits between the three types of transformational gifts that I sort of outlined? Are there common traits amongst those three?
Yeah. Generally, they're either altruistic or investors. Those are the two most common traits we see. Investors in that they want to see something change in the community and they want to be the catalyst and they want to see that investment work. Altruist, well, Chuck Feeney or Joan Crocker, great examples of pure altruism, particularly Chuck, who lives in a single room apartment in San Francisco, where he could be living like a king wherever he wanted. So altruism or investors, those are the two big ones. Lifelong donors, and then the final common trait, obviously, I think everybody gets that, is wealth. And wealth can be accumulated over time in a significant way. So even if somebody is giving you $25 a month for the last 25 years, it could be person of interest potentially. So I'll stop with that. Yeah.
Great. I have one more, if you wouldn't mind, that came through, which is what are your thoughts on starting a legacy, promoting a legacy program during a time of a pandemic like we may be seeing now? Is there any sort of is it tone deaf? Is it something that there should be a concern or a different way of approaching starting or promoting a legacy program at a time that like now?
No, this is hopefully ephemeral.
Mm-hmm.
And I say hopefully in good faith. And no, it should be business as usual. As I said, others are going to do it. They're already doing it. I can't imagine they're actually going to accelerate it. They meaning the players who are in play. Because invariably your competition will be universities, because most individuals who have amassed wealth will have attended a university and maybe had a good experience. The other competition obviously are medical and others. So no, I would not ever stop doing best business practices because of in this case, a pandemic. Much like in 2008 when we had the financial crash, which was artificial. This one's organic. We really actually recommended that people just keep their heads down and do things even more aggressively. And so we would make the same recommendation today. It's called doing business as a 501c. It's doing business as a 501c3. It's not being tone deaf at all. It actually, you're giving people an opportunity, particularly those in position. Because invariably, as I mentioned, the conversation is happening behind closed door with the financial advisor. And the pandemic is not going to influence that conversation. And so be in the game is my recommendation, regardless of timing.
Yeah, that's what we say in marketing. There's never a wrong time to start marketing. You should always be doing it. So yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Rob. And looks like we're all out of questions. So I want to thank Rob so much for imparting his wisdom through the case studies, and thank all of you for coming to our webinar. just want to let everybody know that we will be sending out a couple follow-ups with links to view our video library, where future videos will continue to be added, and with more information if you'd like to chat with either of our speakers to get more information on the topics. We'll also be discussing future webinars. We're running them one per month, so if you haven't already signed up to be notified, please do. Don't worry about seeing them in all the order. They're all separated into topics, so you can view them all standalone. So that's it for today, and we hope that this was helpful. And everyone stay safe and stay healthy and enjoy the rest of your week.